Okay, today we're talking about what I'm calling the grace gap. I've got all these new terms, all these new things that I'm coming up with here. Specifically, this is working in the context of talking about our buyers and sellers. I think that this is showing up more and more right now because of the market that we are in. It has gotten more competitive in some places, longer inventory in others, and the agents that we have. So for years, a lot of agents have been operating these environments where the momentum did a significant amount of the work. Inventory was really tight, rates were low, buyers moved quickly. We know how this showed up. And so we got really good at working in that environment, but that environment is not what we are currently in most parts of the country. I know that there are exceptions. So the market covered a lot of the heavy lifting before, not the case now. Now we've got higher interest rates. We've got inventory that has expanded in most markets. Buyers have more time to think, which means they have more time to second guess, which means they have more time to be picky. Understandable. Sellers are slow to adjust to the reality that homes aren't moving super duper quick. And many are like super emotionally anchored to their pricing expectations from a market that we no longer exist in. This changes the entire emotional context of the transactions that we're working. And I think that what's becoming clear is that a lot of agents have never had to actually work through this type of market. Totally fine. What that means, though, is that many of us are entering into conversations with a skill set or an emotional steadiness that lacks what this market actually requires. Because there's a moment in almost every single transaction where things stop feeling straightforward. A buyer suddenly, who was moving confidently and was excited, they're hesitating now when it's time to make a decision, maybe the inspection repairs. Seller who originally agreed with the strategy, pricing or otherwise, they start second guessing what's happening. Communication starts to shift. They get tense. We respond tensely. It's enough little changes happen that you can feel the energy shift. From the agent's perspective, this gets wildly frustrating. We thought we had a clear plan. We thought everyone was aligned. The next steps make sense to us. And suddenly it feels like the client is pulling away from something that they'd already agreed to. And what I see happening often in those moments is the agent gets tight and the agent gets really rigid. And they start to focus more on trying to get the client back on track, so to speak. So there's like this subtle urgency of like, we got to get back to where we were before. And it feels like the problem needs to be solved as quickly as possible. The problem being the client's emotional state. And again, to be fair, I understand how this happens. The agent's attempting to protect the momentum of the deal or the momentum of the market. We're trying to help the client move forward instead of getting stuck in indecision or, frankly, the wrong move. But what I think is really important for us to remember is that from the client's perspective, there is very little about buying or selling that actually feels predictable, normal, or safe. Buying or selling a home, it is an emotional transaction, even for very logical people. Financial pressure shows up, fear of making the wrong decision shows up, family dynamics, timing issues. All of this stuff is under the surface, and the agent may or may not fully see this. So when hesitation shows up, we think, what are they doing? But we got to go deeper. So what often looks like resistance from the outside is someone who's desperately trying to gain their footing again. And that's where we need to have some grace and create a gap for this grace to show up for our clients. It's not creating a gap between the knowing and the doing. It's creating a gap between what is the client experiencing internally and how does the agent choose to respond externally. Create a gap for that space. Agents absolutely need structure. We need to lead. We need to guide people through the process clearly and confidently. I strongly believe in all of that. But there's a difference between guiding someone and trying to drag them emotionally where you want them to be before they're ready to be there. And in this market, that distinction matters so much more than it used to. So one of the things that I want to introduce for us to think about here is the word gap as an analogy or as a breakdown. So gap, G, get curious about what's actually going on. Quit making assumptions. Ask questions. Get curious. A, align with the client before trying to move things forward. Create a level of trust before you're actually dragging them through the emotional work. And then P, proceed with clarity and urgency. The middle one is the most important. We need to align with them emotionally. We've talked before about you and them versus the problem instead of you versus them, right? Curiosity can feel inefficient. Sometimes we need to slow down even more and really sit with our clients in what they're feeling and experiencing. When we slow down, our clients absolutely feel the difference. They feel heard. They feel like they have a partner. They feel like someone is attempting to understand them rather than I have a salesperson who's trying to pull me over the edge. It doesn't mean that you abandon or just totally stop your standards, your processes, but it does mean that you recognize that sometimes people need a second to emotionally catch up to the decisions that they're being asked to make because they're big decisions. When you recognize this in real time, you typically what's going to end up happening here is that your tightening response is going to loosen. And suddenly you're going to be more human and more empathetic to what's going on with the person across the table with you. When you feel yourself tighten up, you've got to slow down for a second and remember the gap. Most clients do not need less guidance during a transaction, right? But they do need more empathy and more emotional breadth and more space to be able to breathe and lean into the decisions that we're asking them to make. If you can get that right and allow them that space, typically we can get people moving again. And it's not through pressure, it's through alignment, it's through partnership. So think through the next time you feel yourself tighten up, where do I need to create a gap for me to create an emotional environment that's appropriate for the client to be able to move forward?